Hey everyone, Modzy here, back with, we've got another volume 2 of our Pixel Talk podcast, and today again, of course, joined with Nathan, as we are, and today we've got a really interesting podcast topic, sort of a theme that we're doing over the entire two sides of the podcast today. We're going to be focusing on ATI, which is, if you've been around the graphics and PC industry for a while, you may recognise that name, or branding. Now, obviously, AMD, but we're going to be doing a bit of a unique take on it in a way. We're going to do the first half. We're going to be talking about all of ATI's sort of main milestones and successes that they've had, and then in part B, we're going to be covering a lot of their failures or things that they could have done wrong, things that they have done wrong and they could have done a bit differently, and then our sort of point of views and our takes on certain things. But we're going to be sort of focusing on certain video cards throughout their sort of lifespan as well, leading up to the current generation. We're going to sort of gloss over a little bit of some of the very, very early stuff, sort of pre-3D, because neither of us, I don't think, have a huge amount of knowledge in that area. But definitely we're going to be starting at sort of the 3D era and working forwards. Yeah, do you want to just, I guess, introduce yourself there, Nathan, for those who might be tuning in for the first time?
Yeah, so this is a collaboration between Modzy's Retro Collection and PixelPipes, and I am Nathan, the host of PixelPipes. And this is only the second time we've done this, so
yep.
We're still learning the ropes.
Yeah, definitely the first one was a very big learning curve for us, given the fact that we're on opposite sides of the world. Timing for just Skype calls and just the delay in talking and things like that, we've had to sort of manage it and work our way around it a bit. So we do hope that it wasn't too cringeworthy in the first one, but we're trying our best to improve each time we do it. So yeah,
I thought it was fine.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. I had to do a little bit of playing around with the timeline stuff to get it the syncing to work out a little bit, but it was all good. It was all good. Right, so I guess we'll jump in, to the first, point of side A here, which is the very first thing I wanted to point out was how many of you guys might know or have heard of the story of the actual Radeon branding, before it was Radeon, and what actually happened with that sort of stuff. I'm just going to cover it very briefly, but PC Gamer did a really cool article on this, I think in 2016, covering like the backstory about how ATI came up with the Radeon name, and how it actually came about 3 days before the launch of the cards that were supposed to be called something very different. There was complete plans to go ahead with a completely different name known as Radium, which is Radium, which is very radioactive sounding in its name, which is where it's sort of getting its inspiration from. But literally 3 days before the launch of all these products with that branding, the Japanese division kind of went, you can't do that because of the stuff that went on with the whole radiation stuff. My memory's going blank on exactly the particular incident that this was in reference to, but
World War II, little known battle that happened.
Yeah. The Japanese team basically just said could not have any name associated with radioactivity or radiation in any way, shape, or form. So they changed the name to Radeon instead of Radium.
Which leads to the question: if they had gone with Radium, wouldn't they have to color code their logos and stuff in green?
Yeah. That would have been interesting. Yeah. But it's really fascinating, and I've you did a really cool mock-up of like the Radeon style logo, like ATI Radeon, but had the word Radium, and it looked really legitimate to the point where you showed me that image, and I went, "Is that actually one of the, marketing clips?" And he's like, "No, I made that. It looked really, really good."
Yeah, I just mocked that up really fast for the Radeon DDR video that I did. Because the PC Gamer article had come out shortly before I had made that video, and so I just kind of wanted to see myself sort of maybe roughly what that would look like. Supposedly, too, this was such a last-minute change that there was actually promotional materials and stuff made with the name Radium on them that we've never seen. That have never been, I don't know, they're probably either been destroyed or they're filed somewhere in someone's basement. Who knows? It'd be really awesome if that came to light someday, but
Yeah, I would love to see an original Radium box, like just an artwork, a box of what their original concept was for the logo and things like that. Because 3 days before the launch of a product, they have to have had some kind of logo and marketing material floating around. So, it'd be kind of interesting if we could dig some of that up one day. But I guess we'll move on from that and we'll continue with, the first Radeon, in a way, which is, I guess, the 7200 or the Radeon DDR/SDR. Now, you actually have a little bit more knowledge of this card than what I do, so I'll let you sort of kick this one off with, I guess, where ATI is standing with their first launch of the first Radeon card.
yeah, well, we categorize this as a success for a number of reasons. Because while ATI had slowly been kind of building up their competitive standing with each successive 3D accelerator over the years, it wasn't really until the Radeon that they kind of stood on their own as one of the real top tier producers of graphics cards, particularly in reference to what came just before this, which was not a very competitive product. So this one, not only did it start the Radeon name, but it had a slew of features that were first for graphics cards in general in the consumer PC market. And this was under the Hyper-Z kind of branding, which was basically the inclusion of Z buffer and color compression, which is a huge boon for efficiency with memory bandwidth, and geometry culling, which makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be rendering geometry you can't see. And so ATI was attempting to the very beginnings of trying to tackle that issue. And they had support for transform and lighting, which was pretty much the only other card besides the original GeForce and future cards to have transform and lighting in hardware. So it was the first competitor to NVIDIA to match them in that feature.
Yeah.
It was a really big deal in terms of the competitive landscape, because you have to also think this came out in 2000. Now 3DFX was still around, but there were a lot fewer competitors by 2000. Yeah. So ATI was definitely saying, hey, I'm one of the top 3 now. You have to pay attention to what we're doing with the introduction to this card.
Yeah. And, ATI just really did well with, making sure that they marketed their cards to the right people, the right gaming industry and things like that as well. So their features were really prominent with new games that were coming out as well. They were trying to get features that were on the forefront of engine technology and stuff as well. And they really took advantage of a position that 3DFX was really in a bad shape by that point financially, and they couldn't really do a huge amount to compete with NVIDIA either. ATI was kind of that definitely smack bang in the middle. You had on one end the GeForce and you had on the other end 3DFX, which has just come out of such a huge successful past sort of, want to say 3 to 4 years even. And they were, they had their own sort of budget which fit pretty much smack bang in between the two, and they were trying to be on the forefront of making sure they stayed as close to NVIDIA as they could with their cards.
And they were the oldest competitor too. I mean, the company was founded in 1985. So they literally came from a history of creating these IBM compatible 2D add-on cards, video cards, to creating this world suddenly emerging around them of 3D accelerators, and they're like, oh, we have to jump on this. So to go from having basically nothing to scrambling and having a 3D accelerator and then having a really competitive 3D accelerator was a really big deal. And they supported features that actually NVIDIA did not. Besides the Hyper-Z stuff, they also had environmental bump mapping, which was a new thing with DirectX 7. And I talked about this in a couple of my videos, you can get some really cool looking effects using environmental bump mapping. Unfortunately, because NVIDIA didn't support it, that did mean that it didn't see a lot of use in games. But had it been used, you can see some tech demos and some examples of how good that looked, considering the age of these products and the fact that they didn't have programmable pixel shaders. Well, they didn't have programmable pixel shaders exploited by any version of DirectX or the drivers. There's kind of, people like to discuss a lot about the Radeon's hidden pixel shaders, which, never actually got used. But, this was still something that, NVIDIA was never able to do with any of their fixed function hardware. So it was very, very forward-looking in many ways, and in ways that we didn't even realize until years later. So a very impressive card.
Yeah. It was one of those cards that just really, it kind of really did cement ATI in the competition, which was kind of nice. And I've always wondered this myself, which is, we had that downfall of 3DFX, and NVIDIA was really quick to snap up what they could of 3DFX, because they really did see the potential of what they had there. And I've always wondered what would have happened if ATI had have been the one that took 3DFX's assets and their knowledge and technical ability and all that sort of stuff, and their engineers. I reckon we would have a very different landscape today than what we do.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Like, obviously, NVIDIA was the top dogs at the time. I think when the acquisition happened, it was 2001, I think. NVIDIA was the top. I'm sure if ATI had the assets, they would have loved to do that. And the fact of the matter is, other than taking the name SLI, it's really not widely known what they actually benefited from in terms of the assets and the technology and the intellectual property from 3DFX. Supposedly, the GeForce FX series was the first time that their assets and their engineers are able to actually contribute to an NVIDIA product. But to what capacity, I'm not really certain of. That may be something that other people have spoke of online. I just haven't done the research on, but I'm not really aware, and I don't think it is widely known what contribution that had. And whereas I think ATI, being kind of a scrappier company in a way, being a smaller company, could have probably, or maybe have even tried to leverage some of the technologies more directly, even taking, say, the what was going to be the upcoming Rampage chip, and maybe allowing it to fully develop and then become, released a little later on as a mainstream card, or do something like that. So there's lots of possibilities there that we just, it's a what if question, of course, but it does make you think about it.
Yeah. So then we move on to, I guess, one of the real highlights of ATI's early era, which is the Radeon 8500. One of my friends had this card, and this thing lasted. I think he bought it pretty much smack bang when it launched, and he had that thing for probably 3 or 4 years before he finally upgraded, and it just kept churning out, frame rate, kept improving as drivers, really, really did go through the roof.
Because it had a rough start in terms of drivers, and at that time too, there was a lot of accusations of cheating and benchmarks and things, and image quality issues, and issues that would come up a lot later, but for the other camp. But ATI had, this was really truly the beginning, even more so than the original Radeon, of them delivering really great hardware, and of course being let down by the software side of things, at least in the beginning.
When I was doing the research for my GeForce 3 history video, there was a very big swing in performance for the Radeon 8500. It went from being really not able to even compete with the TI 200 to suddenly outperforming the TI 500 towards the later end of its life cycle, purely just because of driver improvements. The card really did have all the features, it really did have the performance, but it was completely let down by the driver side of stuff. And the reviews reflect that. The very early launch reviews are all saying, this card has a lot of untapped potential, and it took probably in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 months to really get it to become the competitive card it was supposed to launch at.
It's kind of unfortunate that the Radeon 8500 had to endure a lot of growing pains from the driver team, because if it had hit the ground running and had not had such, a kind of modeled reputation with gamers, with the community, it probably would have been an even bigger success than it was. But NVIDIA did beat them to the market with the original GeForce 3, and then they later came out after the 8500 was released with the TI 500, which was initially faster. NVIDIA did manage to keep ahead nonetheless, at least for 2001 when that was relevant.
Yeah. And it was sort of the start of when ATI had to really shift focus into the driver development team, because it was becoming reportedly, a lot of media outlets and stuff were reporting just how much they needed to focus some of their efforts and engineers on the software side of it if they wanted to keep up. Because it looked like NVIDIA really was going to be launching another card. You had the whole DirectX 9 era upcoming as well. And, they needed to stay competitive. And one of the biggest ways they needed to do that was driver support.
But it did pay off during that period and contributed to their next product. So that they did have mature drivers from the beginning. And,
of course, we all know the huge golden era, or the golden years, as a lot of people like to call it, with the Radeon 9700 Pro, 9500 Pro, up through the 9800 Pro and XT models. That was some of ATI's most incredible glory years for their hardware. Now you're lucky; you actually have, or have had, I think you still do have, a couple of 9700 Pros, at least one of them there working. Which I'm a little bit jealous of, because I've tried to get my hands on one of those for a while now and had a few failings in trying to buy one of those. But I do have a 9500 Pro and I do have a 9800 Pro.
It'll happen for you, buddy. We talked about this in the first one, podcast. It took me a few tries too, so you're not alone. That being said, the 9700 Pro, there's a reason why it's so sought after nowadays. Holy crap, is this card a big deal? This was kind of a revolutionary product of its time. Just because, the Radeon 8500 was good, of course. But the 9700 Pro was not just good, it was forward-looking. It was so many firsts. It was the first to take on DirectX 9 before the API had even launched yet. Microsoft hadn't even put out the update for it, and there was obviously no software for quite a long time. But it was basically the hardware that DirectX 9, or at least Shader Model 2.0, was based off of, in terms of the precision level of the shader units. And it was the first with the 256-bit memory interface, the first to support 8x 8GP, and it goes on and on. It was an amazing, phenomenal card. But of course, everybody at the time was like, well, of course NVIDIA is going to they're a little late with their flagship, but they're gonna beat it when it comes out. They always do. NVIDIA always wins in the end, right? But no, that didn't happen, and that's what made the 9700 Pro so much more amazing, is that it was several months early, and yet it remained the top performer. And hey, those several months probably went a long way towards helping ATI perfect their drivers when NVIDIA did finally release their competitor. So that was even more help in that regard.
I did my TI 4600 history video, and that was the flagship from NVIDIA that was supposed to take on the 9700 Pro. And it was complete DirectX 8.1. They didn't even bother touching DirectX 9 at all with that card. And on sort of a DirectX 8 versus DirectX 8 sort of level, the 9700 was still better, but the margin wasn't quite as big. But as soon as DirectX 9 come out, that card just, like, it took off in all the benchmarks. And it's most noticeable when you go to... when you chuck in, I think it's either 3D Mark 03, when you put in 3D Mark 03, which is obviously DirectX 9, it's like the Radeon 97 is like 4 times the performance of the TI 4600, which is like the hugest. So the TI 4600 really had a very short lifespan, and ATI needed to do, NVIDIA needed to do something to compete. And of course, what did ATI do? They launched an updated version, the 9800 Pro, and then leading into the 9800 XT, which is probably one of the most sought after ATI cards. It's really, really hard to find the XT expensive model these days.
It's kind of interesting too that you bring up the 4600, because the 4600 came out fairly early on in 2002. But actually, ATI didn't have anything for many months to compete against it. It basically sat out that entire year. And they had I think the only product they introduced was like an updated Radeon 8500 that had 128 megs of memory. And it's like, it didn't really boost performance except in those edge cases. So, NVIDIA for that entire year is just the reigning champ, and again, that kind of feeds into that mentality that fanboys had at that time, that NVIDIA is always going to reign supreme. ATI is just standing idly by, but that's because ATI had, I'm sure, considered releasing an updated DirectX 8 card, but decided to move forward with a DirectX 9 architecture. And yeah, like you said, the NVIDIA, their 5800 Ultra was a failure. And
I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on an FX chip, a high-end one, and really diving into the details of, that architecture and how it just, some people have it in a very mixed light where the ATI, some ATI fans are like, nope, ATI was completely dominant from the 9700 Pro right through to the X800 series and beyond, and NVIDIA had nothing during that time that could compete. But then you have some people like, well, actually the FX series did compete, but it was competing late to the party. Like, it was always late to catch up. It never really come out with something that was faster and newer and then stayed that way for a generation, whereas ATI just kept that lead right through that entire architecture life cycle.
That was very much a tit-for-tat generation, or just, I should say, era, multiple generations, where, they would release a refreshed version of the 5900 Ultra, ATI would release the 9800 Pro, the 5950 Ultra come out, then the 9800 XT would come out, and it's just, ATI was was a totally changed company. They maintained their lead all throughout those years.
Then we lead into like the X800 series, and you have that definite jump to full DirectX 9 support. And you had NVIDIA with their 6800 series cards, with full shader model 3 support, and ATI decided to not do what they did with the 9700 Pro and completely future-proof it in terms of what's coming up next. The X800 decided to stay with shader model 2 and not go with shader model 3, which was coming out, which was a bit of a confusing thing at the time. And I do remember reading a lot of reviews and review outlets about this card, and they're like, why did they do that? Because they already had the lead, they already had well and truly the finances to be able to implement that sort of a feature, but they just thought, maybe it's not really worth it. And then suddenly we all know what happened when NVIDIA launched their cards. I mean, you've actually got I've got an X850 XT PE PCI Express. Do you have one of the AGP variants of the X800 at all? Do not. No, I don't either. I tried to find one of the AGP X850 XTPEs, but they're really, really hard to find, and they get snapped up pretty quickly and go for a little bit. But yeah, the features on the X800 were also really, really good, except for the Shader Model 3 side of things. So they did have all of the stuff that was hitting the points, except for Shader Model 3. So when, of course, Half-Life 2 had come out, and those cards really shone in the Source engine really, really well. And of course, the Source engine with Half-Life 2 being so big, ATI had a really good boost in sales for that range of cards as well, regardless of the lack of Shader Model 3 support. So they kind of got carried a little bit by some of the games that came out that didn't quite really need that Shader Model 3 support, but were still...
there was good. There's a good argument to be made that they never needed Shader Model 3.0 for that era of cards. It was never even powerful enough to run games when they finally did use Shader Model 3.0 extensively. And again, you have to imagine at the time of the FX series, NVIDIA had accumulated so much negative reputation that ATI was, had a lot of fanboys behind them, or had a lot of fans, I should say, in general. They weren't necessarily fanboys. They were just fans of ATI they had a lot of people defending them. It's like, well, NVIDIA is just, they created the Shader Model 3.0 standard alongside Microsoft, and they're just trying to, muscle out, ATI or whatever by, unnecessary features or whatnot. There's the debate went back and forth at that time. But it was never really that clear at that time that this was important.
Yeah. And of course, then we had the lead into the next range of cards, which was the X1800 XT. Of course, we had the X1800 XT, and you're actually lucky enough, you own one of those cards, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, they're not rare, difficult to find at all whatsoever. But they're an interesting card, because we were actually talking about this before we started recording. The X800 XT, as I remember it, and as you remember it, when it first came out, was actually kind of a disappointing card. Yeah. It came out, I think, a little bit after NVIDIA's 7800 GTX, the 256 megabyte version, and was a little lacking in terms of performance. It had 16 pipes, which was the same amount of pipes that the X800 series maxed out at. So it's like, this is a new generation? I mean, really? But the one important thing that they did was that they reached feature parity with NVIDIA at that time. Yeah. And their clock speed was so ridiculously high compared to NVIDIA's as well that they kind of overcame a lot of that. And especially as, time went on, drivers only improved the competitive standing of the X800 XT, or X1800 XT rather.
Yeah.
And so I've done testing since, with best optimal drivers and a faster CPU, and honestly, the X1800 XT was still faster than NVIDIA's card at the time that it was released, as long as you have those things going for it. And that does tend to be the case with ATI, is that they get faster with better, newer drivers.
Yeah. Seems to be a bit of a recurring theme here we're getting with the driver side of things.
Yes, very much so.
It's interesting, I was doing, when I did my X1950 history video, I intentionally went back because I never really experienced, I kind of skipped that early first generation of ATI cards, the X1800 XT. I was NVIDIA at that point, and I wasn't really actually even doing a lot of research at that point as to the performance of those cards either. So when going back and reading a lot of the articles and things like that, there was a lot of contrasting reviews depending on the date of the article when it was written. If it was written very, very early in the life cycle of the X1800, you can definitely see that there was a little bit of confusion with why they stuck with the same number of pixel pipes, and why they just didn't bump it up like NVIDIA did, going from like the 6800 Ultra up to the 7800 GTX. And so there's a little bit of confusion with that. And then, of course, the driver performance, again, was sort of a little bit lacking. But once those drivers did start to take off, NVIDIA felt the pressure, absolutely. That card really did pick up performance sort of within even 6 months of it being launched. It was definitely overtaking the 7800 GTX. But then, of course, as NVIDIA does, they were like, nope, nope, nope. And they dropped another card, which was I think it was a node shrink, or like a die shrink.
Initially, no. Initially, it was just they went from like the 256 meg version, which is the single slot card.
Yep.
And then they went to the 512 meg version, which is the same exact GPU, but required flame decals on it because it ran so much hotter. No. The dual slot cooler allowed them to ramp the clock speeds way higher, so that in conjunction with having more pipes, 24 on theirs versus ATI 16, made theirs faster. But of course, ATI wasn't resting on their laurels.
Yeah. We had, I guess it was the 1900 when that one launched initially. That one did really well for ATI. It was a nice shrink as well. A little bit. I remember it being at much higher clock speeds than the X1800. But the main thing that they did was going from the X1800 to the X1900 was that huge jump in pixel pipes that they had. If I'm remembering my own video correctly, it was like 16 to 40.
48.
Which was 48. Yeah, 48. I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah. That is such a huge jump that the performance just went through the roof.
Yeah.
And of course, then NVIDIA did do the 7900 GTX to compete with it. And then, of course, ATI came back again with the X1950 XTX. And it was a bit of a...
Yeah, they're constantly, all through these years, ever since like 2002, 2003, they're just each time one-upping each other. And, you know... ATI kind of started this idea too that, wait a minute, the pixel shaders are different from the pixel pipes all of a sudden, because we had never separated those two ideas at that time before then. It was always you had 24 pipes, or you had 16 pipes, you had 8 pipes, that was 8 shader units, 8 ROPs, 8 texture units, all the way through the entire line. And ATI is like, oh, actually, you don't have to do it symmetrically like that. You can have the 16 pipes, which the X1900 and X1950 still do, but then you have triple the number of shader units in each of those pipes. So that equals out to 48 shader units. You still have 16 texture mapping units and 16 ROPs, rasterizers. So, you know, it was... At that time, you know, you're talking about we're starting to actually get into using Shader Model 3.0 features. And these are all still DirectX 9 cards. You know, you get into like the Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and you had like Unreal Engine 3 games on the horizon, which weren't quite out yet, but they were coming soon. You know, we're starting to see the features used heavily in Shader Model 3.0. It did make a huge difference.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was Unreal 2. When I first saw that game demoed, I must have been on an X1950 XTX. The first time I saw Shader Model 3 in a updated Unreal Engine. And the difference looking at like Unreal Tournament 99 to Unreal 2 and that Shader Model 3 engine was like crazy. But I think from memory, even they stated when Unreal 2 came out, it was still technically a DirectX 8.1 game with some tacked on like updated features for DirectX 9. And I don't think from memory it was actually full Shader Model 3. I could have actually mistakenly quoted that. It might have only been Shader Model 2. But either way, I know when Unreal Tournament 2003 finally came out, that game was really, really nice looking and was miles ahead. But I think, what else... Of course, forgetting here, Far Cry, the original Far Cry, when that thing came out, of course, again as well, huge Shader Model 3 game. That thing was the...
Was
that only 2?
Far Cry was Shader Model 2.0. That was the original DirectX 9.
Right.
So
What was Shader Model 3?
Shader Model 3 was DirectX 9C. It came.
I thought.
Yeah.
Oh,
So it came.
Okay. I could have been remembering that wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Unreal 2 was it was primarily a fixed function game. It was like a DirectX 7 game, but I think it used some DirectX 8 features, shader model 1.1 features. Then you get to DirectX 9, shader model 2. Far Cry was the first example of here's what you can really do with this, and it was a huge bump in image quality, and that was one of those games where all of a sudden people with GeForce FX cards were like, why is this performed so bad? I mean, it was when you started to see a major discrepancy, you started to realize, hey, wait a minute, ATI was actually, this is what they're waiting for all along, was the first real Shader Model 2.0 game. Their first one to really utilize it to come along.
Yeah. And it was this era that kind of really dramatically grew in terms of the size of the company as well. So they had a massive revenue boost as well, and their market share kind of really went through the roof with that era, because suddenly their cards that had been forward thinking and forward feature set really did sort of shine in those years to come. That sort of meant everyone was saying, well, actually, I bought this card early, I'm going to keep hanging on to it for that little bit longer, or I might go with ATI again because, that's just what they were at the time. Okay, they're forward thinking, I'm going to buy their next card. And so ATI kind of did hold on to and grow their market share.
They had generated a ton of goodwill among consumers.
Yeah.
Since executing so well with the 9700 Pro, and then every generation after that, on and on, all throughout the DirectX 9 era, there were people that would only buy ATI's hardware because they pretty much had almost this reputation of, well, it kind of reversed roles. All of a sudden, ATI was assumed to be the fastest. At this time, they were the speed kings, which is amazing to think about nowadays, with the way things are at the moment. But, back then they were the dominant company in terms of raw performance and technology.
Yeah. And then we're gonna skip the in-between generation here, which was the 2900 XT, because we're going to leave that for the second part of the show, which is going to be a little bit more where it's going to fit into the grand scheme of things. But of course, we have a very very big focus shift for ATI coming into their HD 3000 generation of cards, where they've actually then switched to an era of building smaller GPUs. And I know you've got a little bit of knowledge of this era as well, probably a little bit more than what I do.
They were definitely, we're talking about the height of ATI's dominance. By this point, we're talking, 2007, 2008. They were a much more humble company because they had a stumbling, had hit a stumbling block. And so they decided, actually it doesn't make a lot of sense to just completely burn out all of your resources on making a massive chip, the top performing chip each and every time, and trying to one-up. Again, we were talking about before with the one-upping each other with every card. Yeah. For every, sneeze, there's an achoo. So, they decided, let's get smart about this by building those smaller GPUs. And starting with the Radeon HD 3870, they're really targeting a specific price point. So they wanted something that was, was the best $300 graphics card that they could build, basically. And it was, in some ways it wasn't a lot more powerful than the previous generation, if you even want to call them separate generations. But because they were built for that specific price range, they could build them smaller, more efficient, and easier to manufacture, so you could get higher yields and really focus not just on performance per dollar, but also performance per watt. And meanwhile, NVIDIA was still in that old style of thinking of, let's build the biggest, baddest chip that we can build. And so they would release cards like the GTX 280, and then later on the GTX 480, which are notoriously like power hungry, inefficient cards that are just built for the raw, most performance you can get. And ATI was, just, again, they're just playing it smart. And this ended up being a huge boon for them, because this was we're talking about ATI's successes. The reason this is a success is because who's really buying graphics cards? They're not going after the $500 plus bracket of performance most of the time, especially at this time when we're talking probably most PC gamers were, adults, but probably not highly successful, 30, 40-year-olds, probably more like in their 18, 20s, early 30s, who didn't have that kind of disposable income. They're going to spend $200, $300 on these cards. And when ATI, I guess they're AMD by this point, could say, hey, we've got the best card for that price range, bar none, then that's kind of a huge selling point in favor of them. And it really gained them a lot of, helped to maintain their market share, helped to maintain their revenue and success, even though they weren't necessarily the top performers.
Yeah, and there's another point about that as well, which really led to ATI's success with these this style of cards was, of course, their Crossfire technology. Having two really good and well thought out and well designed lower end cards at a really good price point, suddenly you could afford two of them for cheaper than what Nvidia was pumping out their single high end, and you could end up beating the Nvidia's single high end in both price and performance by adding two of these ATI cards in. So the 3870 really did go through the roof there. And of course, ATI themselves even then produced the I believe it was the
3870 X2.
Probably going to get that wrong. That's what it was. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, that's what it was. The X2, the dual chip one, which essentially was, I believe it was two 3850 cores, or was it actually two 3870 cores? Because I know they had two. They might have done two different versions.
They definitely had one that was like a full 3870, because they had built the 3870 to be able to do that. Or the RV670 core, to be able to, keep the full performance, but even with like two of them on a single board.
Yeah, and I mean this was an era where I remember games like Company of Heroes and stuff coming out, which were really, really impressive graphically, and you had, these $500-$600 monster Nvidia cards that were. I mean, here in Australia, the 4870 was basically just a barbecue grill. That thing was crazy. I know I had a really good friend who actually bought three of them, and he said it was the most regretful PC decision or purchase he has ever made. He didn't do any research into those cards when they came out. He had something like I think he went from like two 8800 GTSs to just three GTX 480s, and he just said that was just the biggest mistake ever because of how crazy, and that's my phone. Sorry. But yeah, and then of course ATI kept going with this, building a small chip rather than going after that pure high end, biggest monster through the 4000 and then up through the 5000 series as well. Did you have much experience with the 4000 generation at all?
I didn't, but it was an even bigger success. Like, I remember I was definitely still active in the PC gaming community, and the 4870 was just and we have to talk about, like you mentioned, the 3850 and now the 4850. Those were massively successful as well, because you really weren't losing a lot of performance. And they were like $250 for those cards. It was like a ridiculous price for the performance, at least in American currency. And they were just crazy. Like, and then you had the 4870 X2 again, but then they released the 4870 1 gig version, which actually did have a tangible improvement in performance. So that I remember that 4870 1 GB as being like, I think even an Antec basically said it was the only card you need to buy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I I remember being at that point. I was living in a place. I had a couple of friends that I was living with, and everyone that I knew that we all went to LAN parties together, and I think the majority of people I knew all went from the 3000 to the 4000 to the 5000 series of cards, and maybe one or two of us ended up with Nvidia, because of just how good those cards were. And I think we had an ATI household at one point where all of us had an ATI, either a 3000, a 4000, or a 5000 generation card, because of just how good they were and how price efficient they were, like cost effective they were. They were really, really good for them. But yeah, and then of course the multi GPU side of thing really took off. Their scaling got a little bit better. But about the 4000 generation, they also did a 4890, I believe, as well, which was like that slightly higher version of the 4870.
Yeah, it was like a very slightly higher clocked card.
I can't remember if they did like either a die shrink or something, or whether it was just the same card but just slightly higher clock speeds.
I don't think there was a die shrink for that one. I can check real quick.
Yeah, I can't remember, but I know the 5000 series really was one of that those high points for ATI's or AMD at this point, definitely AMD's history. Those cards were marketed really well. They had really good price for performance, and Nvidia had the 400 series, and then the 500 series being that sort of slightly stepped up version or slightly more refined version of the 400 series. And ATI's cards were they were really performing really well. They were good efficiently. They weren't very hot. Some of the higher end ones were a little bit hot, especially the dual chip ones, like the one that I've got up there. But they performed really well.
But that's kind of how
really well for the games
silly
at the
it was for Nvidia, because they had these single chip cards that were pretty much using as much power and generating as much heat as Nvidia, as AMD's dual chip, like your 5970 there. Wasn't any more expensive than a GTX 480, and yet I think it was cheaper. I think it was even cheaper.
Yeah. I think it was because they came out at different times, and I believe that the GTX 480 had dropped in price by the time the 5970 came out. I could be completely wrong, so don't quote me on that. I could be absolutely wrong, but from memory.
Just for the sake of completeness in this podcast, I do want to mention real quick that the 4890 was a core revision, but it was not a die shrink. So they revised it so it could yield a little bit better and clock a little bit higher. It was running, I have two clocks here, anywhere between 850 and 900 megahertz, whereas the 4870 was a 750 megahertz core clock. So just to clarify for the sake of completeness, lest we be assaulted by comments. But yes, that's what the 4890 was.
Yeah. And I remember, because there was also so we had the 3870X2, the 4870X2, the 5970 dual chip, and then we move into the 6000 series, which I believe is the precursor to, of course, GCN, which we'll move on to in a minute. But the 6000 series kind of really fell a little bit short, because that was right when Nvidia did, I believe, I could be a little bit wrong here, but I believe that was competing with the
Not quite.
600 series from Nvidia.
Not quite.
I think
it was
not
the
quite.
500,
So it was
but the 500 series was really
series,
good.
Then it must have been.
Was the thing.
Yeah.
Like when we talk about you're in particular, you're a huge fan of the mainstream 500 series cars at that time. And like the 560 Ti was like this amazing, huge seller at that time. Whereas the 6870, the 6850, they weren't really any faster than the 5870 and so on. They were just built a little bit more efficiently.
Yep.
So again, it's still keeping in with that strategy of building a small, efficient GPU. And, but it was just a refinement, which NVIDIA's was as well at that time. But, it just wasn't as competitive. And by then, NVIDIA had worked out the kinks. The 580, the GTX 580 was a good card. It wasn't as crazy as the 480 in terms of heat and power consumption. So by then, they weren't doing quite as well as NVIDIA, but...
Yeah, I think NVIDIA had definitely sort of regained. One of my friends actually had two 6950s, and he had them right up until the 900 series NVIDIA cards come out, and he swapped those two out for two GTX 970s. And he said those two 6000 series cards he had did him well right up until that point. They were still holding their own. And drivers were actually really, really good for support through like Battlefield 3 and even Battlefield 4 in some cases as well. But then, of course, we move on to ATI, or I keep saying ATI, but I guess it's definitely NVIDIA, AMD at this point, the GCN architecture, which was a really big deal.
Yeah, and of course we're talking about the GameCube here.
Yeah.
You probably thought we were talking about the architecture. No, I'm just kidding. Well, ATI did make the graphics chip for the GameCube, which was relatively successful, mostly.
Yeah.
The GCN architecture. Mostly. What can you really say about that? Because we're still using it, and it's highly influential in terms of. We'll just look at DirectX 12. Like the way that DirectX 12 handles the whole concurrent thread debacle thing, controversy with NVIDIA's Maxwell chips. That's kind of one of the big optimization features built into DirectX 12, which AMD does really well. And talk about the consoles. They are what they are thanks to GCN.
Yeah, ATI, I keep going to say ATI. AMD really had a foothold at that point on the console market, and that GCN architecture was really attractive to all of the console makers, because of how easily scalable it was to suit a console. It wasn't just like this single flagship that didn't really scale down other than just cutting parts out of it. You could really design a GCN architecture chip custom to a console that was that would take full utilization of that chip and of that architecture and the games that were out at the time. So AMD had some really good successes, and I think the console success really did push the GCN architecture forward and really give AMD the income and the revenue that they needed to keep improving. But I'm not too sure what they did with it, because they moved. You had I believe they had the initial launch of the 7970, which was I think around, I want to say like the 900 to 950 megahertz range, and then they launched a gigahertz edition card that was like a step up, which was just faster clock speeds essentially. And that was the flagship GCN architecture. That card really handled itself really well, and it was absolutely competing against NVIDIA's offerings very, very strong. But then I'm not sure what actually happened, why they decided to just do refreshes and focus on going back to that single big core again rather than the smaller ones.
It was kind of a strange error. They were making big, hot GPUs again. They were doing a lot of rebranding. I think they had some management issues at the time, right before Raja Koduri was, brought up and then, created the Radeon Technologies Group. There's that kind of that like sag in the history of right before what that happened, where, I don't think they took their graphics division very seriously, or whatever the case was. It's at the same time, they were, the entire industry, graphics card industry, was stuck on 28 nanometer for several years. And to NVIDIA's credit, they managed to go from, Kepler, the GTX 680, all the way up to the GTX 980 Ti and the Titans, and they managed to improve performance greatly within that same 28 nanometer manufacturing node, which was very, very impressive. But AMD wasn't quite as agile there.
So I mean, you're mentioning like the whole DirectX architecture and the API side of things. Of course, we had Vulkan and really good performance coming out of that, and the software side of the GCN architecture really did meant that architecture held on for a lot of years, which kind of enabled it's one of those positive things for why ATI decided to keep rebadging that architecture and moving the 7970 into the 280X and then eventually the 380X. While they were revisions, they weren't just straight copy paste, stick a label on. Especially going to the 380X, the software side of things really did meant that those cards really did hang on. The architecture hung on for quite a while, and it stayed relatively competitive. You did definitely have to pair up two of those cards to beat NVIDIA's flagship. But of course, then AMD.
It was a little bit unfair when you start talking about Titans during this era.
Yeah, a little bit. But of course, AMD. I keep going to say ATI. I need to get that out of my head. AMD had they were working on, of course, Fury, and those cards, and it was like this real split between what they had been doing and doing very successfully for those sort of early GCN and lifespan, and then suddenly they were like, nope, we're going to be working on this high-end card, and we're going back to the single chip dominant era again. But yeah,
which was an interesting chip. It was the Fiji core was, we're talking about the introduction of high bandwidth memory. In that sense, AMD was innovating. I think the R9 Fury series, or the R9 Nano, which is part of that, is a really interesting series of cards, even though, you can't really count it a success because it had a lot of shortcomings. It was not the fastest performer. Even with newer drivers, it never was the fastest performer. Yeah. It was hamstrung by only having 4 gigs of memory. But it was still very impressive in terms of the technologies it was adopting and kind of laying the groundwork for what we perceive as probably what will be the future of how graphics cards are built, with the memory embedded on the package with the GPU. Yeah. It was an experimental card, but it was at least an advancement. It was not a rebadge. They went from 2816 stream processors to 4096, so it was a big jump from, again, we're still talking 28 nanometer here, so it's a very, very difficult thing to try to advance your technology when you don't necessarily have more transistors, or you don't have a lot more transistors to be able to pack in there. Finally, after that whole era, we finally get the option to have 16 and 14 nanometer GPUs.
Yeah, and this was like the really good sort of entry success, or going back to the whole smaller chip as well. And we had the Polaris mainstream cards. We had the 470, the RX 470 and 480, which were very, very popular cards, performed really, really well. And it was back to that, hey, you can get 2 of these and still be better price for performance versus NVIDIA's top-end cards. And suddenly AMD had a very good performing and very successful, that sweet spot of gamers' budgets, which is not the $1,000 cards, it's the $300 to $300 cards that were the bulk of their success previously. You actually have one of those cards, so you actually have a little bit of experience with one of those.
Yes, and the RX 480, which is the one I have, is a very, very good card. It feels high end if you're if you don't have a crazy resolution and you're not running like 4K.
Yeah.
I'm running an ultra wide screen. I have a 2560 by 1080, so it's not even. It's a little bit under what your typical 2K screen is even, and it feels like a high end card for me.
Yeah.
It's just a very, very efficient performer, very power efficient, very just fast. And again, we're talking about AMD here, so the drivers are just going to continue to improve the performance, and they have.
Yeah.
NVIDIA came out with the 1060, and that beat the 480 initially, or the 580. I don't know.
I believe it was the Maxwell architecture. So the 960 and 970 were competing initially with the RX 400 series, but there was kind of a timeline mismatch there, where NVIDIA, I think NVIDIA launched the 10 series just after the 500 series come out, because I believe it was like a refresh going from the 400 to 500, a little bit of a refresh.
I'm a little fuzzy there too, but I do know that the 1060 was not far behind.
No.
And it was initially faster, but
and of course there's two models of the 1060 as well. So there's the 3 gig and then there's the 6 gig. So
and you have to be careful
makes
about
it
that.
even more confusing, because some people are like, no, my 1060 is actually faster. And it's like, well, yes, but which one do you actually have?
Because that makes the difference to power.
Yeah.
But now you look at it. Generally speaking, AMD is has the fastest performing mainstream card. Of course, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is that you can't actually buy these cards right now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Which you could briefly, before the big mining surge and all this stuff. These were very, very, and even Vega cards I think were briefly back in stock, and you could get them at MSRP before mining took off again. But I still contend, because we're gonna go into this more in side B. While AMD was not executing on the high end, Polaris and the mainstream cards in general were still very, very good.
Yeah. And it was just, I'm trying not to go down the whole mining discussion thing, because it's such a sensitive topic with so many people. And all I'm going to say is I wish that I had the ability to buy one of the 500 series cards, because it is the exact price for performance that I wanted to buy for my partner's PC right when I was upgrading her. I did a Christmas upgrade for her because she was stuck on a really old CPU architecture platform, and I had the budget there to put in to buy a new updated video card for her, but there was just nothing here in Australia within that price point. And the cards that were available, you could buy a 570 and a 580, but they were double the price. And so at that point, it is absolutely not worth buying them at all, because you can buy a second-hand card that has comparable performance for a lot cheaper. And I just happen to have my spare GTX 770, which I chucked into her system for that. So,
It's unfortunate. I don't think it's controversial to say that, hey, I would have loved to buy these cards and I can't. It's gonna be frustrating. We could probably talk for a long time, but it is kind of hurting AMD's position in the sort of consumer PC gaming market, because as much as I want to say, hey, these mainstream cards are massive success, they're so overpriced for gaming purposes that you really can't. That whole issue is just completely clouded now. So, in theory, yes, it is a very competitive card.
Yeah, I think about it like if GPU mining wasn't a thing and it stayed on the actual dedicated like Bitcoin mining things that come out. If altcoin wasn't a thing and suddenly GPUs were back at MSRP and gamers could buy them, and we were in a market where they were all at the good pricing and things like that, how well would have the 500 and 400 series really held on? And how much of an income deficit would there be between gamers buying them and then the massive mining boom? Like, how much of a difference in income would have AMD actually had?
I mean, possibly none.
What is the difference?
Possibly none, because all the markup is coming from the e-tailers, and now even the retailers are getting in on it, because I've seen some pictures posted on Twitter of Best Buy marking up their cards that they get in now. So that's awesome. But AMD doesn't see any of that extra money. That's like another $200-$300 that goes directly into the pockets of the store that's selling it. But they are selling through 100%. As many as they can make are selling, so that's still a win for them. It's just not for anything based on reasons of gaming performance or power. Well, power consumption is a factor, but not in terms of DirectX 12 performance or any of that. Not for what this card was intended for, but that doesn't really necessarily matter to them. It's just
at the end of the day, they're getting the sales, they're getting the income that they need to keep progressing in the market, rather than becoming irrelevant or trying to combat it and then just running out of money to really do anything.
And on top of that, their CPUs are doing really well too.
Oh yeah,
which segues nicely into the next success.
Yes, yeah. GCN 5 Vega matched APUs, which I've been looking around and I've been reading and seeing all the YouTube videos from all of the popular tech channels, and I'm hearing nothing but good things about these chips. In fact, there's a common theme which I'm seeing amongst them, which is you no longer need to buy a dedicated GPU if you're building an entry-level gaming PC anymore at all. You can pretty much get away, if your budget is like that real entry-level budget, you can get away with buying an APU with one of these Vega cores in it and have that entry-level experience that you would have otherwise needed to buy a dedicated card for if you went Intel, for example.
For that reason, I think these are going to be a massive success. Because I've seen a lot of naysayers saying, oh, why would you ever use integrated graphics for gaming? Now, aside from the fact that these are freaking excellent for integrated graphics, like we have never seen performance like this in an integrated package. Just the fact that because you literally cannot buy a modern day graphics card right now, not for a reasonable price. I see a lot of people buying these chips so they can wait out the mining craze.
Yeah.
Just kind of wait it out until things calm down, until graphics cards become reasonable again, and that's a drop-in upgrade. You can get any motherboard you want. You can get the best. You could get the 370 chipset. The best. From Gigabyte or ASRock or whatever, and get this APU to go in it, and you put in a graphics card when you can finally get one, and you still have excellent CPU performance, because the Ryzen 5 2400G is a quad core with SMT, so it's got 8 threads, so it's a very good performing chip with games.
I believe it's pretty much just a higher clocked 1600. It might even be higher than the 1600X. So it's pretty much a 1600, which was a very highly recommended CPU with a Vega, like a very good integrated GPU slapped onto it. So it absolutely, it's why it's getting recommended. But speaking specifically of like GCN architecture, it was designed. It's got definitely some shortcomings to it, but its most positive design element is its scalability. The fact that it can go from a Vega Frontier Edition, I guess is the highest end one, but a Vega 56 and 64, all the way down to notebook scale, cards, and have that same architecture be really flexible. That's really what you want out of a GPU architecture. The ability to scale it from one end to the other, so you're not having to completely revise or redesign an entire chip just for different segments of the market.
It's been extremely successful, not just
really good.
not just in consoles, but we also have to remember that Intel is even going to be using these cores.
Yeah, I forgot about that, actually.
You know, this is like this. The GCN architecture throughout its many revisions has gone to a lot of places and can fit in a lot of places. It's and because of that, you know, you have all of these games basically that have to be built for this architecture and have to be able to run well on it, which you would think would give AMD a big advantage, and sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't, unfortunately. But you know, just the fact that this, you know, especially with these APUs, it's that right time for these. It's like that little bit of solace for gamers nowadays. It's the perfect time where we're looking for GPUs and we can't buy GPUs. But miners aren't going to touch these APUs because they would have to buy a whole motherboard, and they can only put one on each motherboard. So miners don't care about these APUs. So now gamers are going to, you know, that have been desperate to upgrade are going to want these instead, which can still drive up the prices, but not to, you know, hopefully crazy levels.
Yeah. A really a final sort of note and a really perfect example of this. I have an old colleague of mine who has a couple of kids, and her youngest son was wanting to build a system about 2 years ago, and it was almost impossible to find a good gaming solution for the price point that he was looking at. This absolutely fills that void, because now more than ever it would have been completely impossible to buy any decent GPU, you know, to play the games that he wanted to. But something like this slots into that entry level gap really, really nicely, and gives you the performance to go with it, which is really nice. Especially if you're just doing 1080p gaming.
Yeah.
These things are really good for that entry, like 1080p entry level sort of stuff. They handle really well. And I think it's Random HD Gaming, if you're not familiar with that channel. I think he has a 2200G, or it might even be a 2400G. It's one of the two. He's actually doing a little bit of testing on that at the moment. And he does some retro stuff as well, if you're not familiar with him. Got some really good point of views actually for that chip. But yeah, I think that's going to round out the. Unless you had a few more final points.
Yeah, to note about I just checked just now, and you can still, like, the prices are at MSRP for both of these chips. The 2200G, which is a quad core without hyper-threading, and the graphics chip is quite a bit downgraded. And the 2400G. The 2200G is a $99 CPU. The 2400G is a $169 package. So yeah, these are available. You can buy them, and then you can have a solution. And like you said, they're performing great in 1080 at around medium settings typically for modern games, which is crazy to think about for an integrated graphics chip to be able to do, considering that was like, that cost at least $200 just 10 years ago to be able to do that same thing for a discrete card, a separate add-in card. So yeah, it's really exciting, I think, as a product, especially in this current climate.
I think the most exciting thing that just come to mind actually is this is the perfect architecture, the perfect chip to now take to the console makers and go, now look what we can do. Is this like, because this looks like a product that would fit perfectly into the console space. The level of performance of these Ryzen cores are, yes, it might not be to the same level as like the Xbox One X, but I would argue that the 2400G 1080p versus 1080p is probably comparable to like the original Xbox One in terms of its capabilities, because the original Xbox One, I think, is using like a RX 470 or 400 generation chip.
The original Xbox One and PS4 are using the first generation GCN. Right,
so it's actually even older.
We're talking like,
wow. See, I'm not a console person, so
they're the original Xbox One was kind of underpowered, and yes, the Xbox One X can pack a lot more, performance. I think the X. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but the Xbox One X has over 1,000 stream processors, whereas the 2400G has over 700. So there's a difference there because you're getting more CPU performance in the Ryzen 5 APU. They're using a mobile version of a CPU for the consoles, and they're supplementing it with a separate chip to get the most out of the graphics chip. This is kind of an interesting setup there. But I would have loved to have seen them incorporate more CPU power into like the Xbox One X using technology like this, because more CPU performance means more AI NPCs running around, more dense worlds, bigger worlds. That CPU power can go a long way. But that's another discussion entirely.
Yeah. I think I guess one closing note on that is a lot of people have a bit of confusion behind what really is the lacking power when it comes to a console. Is it the graphics or is it the CPU side of things? And it's really a balance of both. You've got to have the CPU architecture and the horsepower of the CPU to feed the raw numbers into the GPU for it to do its workload. And if you don't have that sort of balance just right, you end up with a situation where you're having to scale down games. I think it was Watch Dogs or one of the ones that come out, like the original E3 footage was like really different to what the final release was, because they had to cut down the quality just to get it to run at the performance numbers they needed to on the consoles. But
So that's.
I think that'll close out. We're going to talk over each other. Yeah, I think that'll close out the side A, which is the main successes of ATI's history. I'm definitely sure we haven't covered every single thing. There's definitely going to be some particular cards in there that have really shone over the years. Some definite technology advancements that ATI really did first as well that we might have skipped along the way. But now we get to move on to side B and cover the real juicy stuff, which is the downsides, the mistakes, the things that they've done wrong. So if you want to head over to PixelPipes YouTube channel, Nathan's channel over there, and we will have side B for you guys. So see you in the next few minutes if you head over now.